Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, cut off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
With your no good and camp, you're listening to the And Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson. Unfortunately, the Windy City representative, the baddest brother above the Mason-Dixon line, my play cousin, the Right Reverend Christopher Butler, is not here with us today because he's on a much-needed, well-earned vacation. He's on sabbatical, and we fully support him in that and look forward to him coming back. But don't rush, brother. Get your rest, and I pray that you and your family are having a good time. But he will be back, okay? That I can promise you, and I know y'all will be looking forward to that. But until then, you're going to be stuck with me. You're going to be stuck with my monologues and all that comes with that. So hopefully you're gracious enough to stick with us. If you're anything like me, you were a little hurt, if not distraught, about the end of the Olympics. I really enjoyed watching the games with my boys. I enjoyed watching the sports that I loved. I also enjoyed watching more random sports that I had to kind of get to know. And it was hard to see it go. I guess it had to come to an end sometimes, but it was hard to see it go. Now, I will say this on the bright side, it ended just the way that it needed to end. It ended with America leading in the medal count, and that's only right. It ended with America showing dominance, some athletic dominance in the Olympics, just the way it should have been, and in a good place at number one. I mean, we had a good number of medals, more than number two, which was China. Again, that's only right, and so we handled our business as I thought we would, and I'm proud to say that America did its thing. Now, one of the stories that stuck out to me, probably one of the stories that stuck out to me most, and there were so many great stories that come along with the Olympics, is what I saw in Sha'Carri. And Sha'Carri is to the point now where I'm not even going to say her last name. She's just Sha'Carri. She's been through a lot. But what I saw in her this time around was a maturity. 4 years ago, she got in some trouble, wasn't able to make it. But I saw a maturity that really blessed my heart in how she responded to everything that was going on. She didn't win the 100 meters. She medaled, but she didn't win. But even in her response to not winning, you saw a maturity in her that really shows she's a grown-up person. She's still a very young lady. The beauty is she was still herself. She was still a big personality, all that comes with that. But there was a maturity in how she carried herself, which tells me that instead of blaming others and not taking responsibility for what happened, she actually took it to heart and grew based on what happened to her 4 years ago. And I don't know about y'all, but that was just a blessing to see. Shout out to her, because you love to see people mature. I mean, these are young people, and I don't know that we always have enough grace when we see young athletes and all the fame that they have, and maybe we assume we would do a lot better. They're under a lot of pressure. They have cameras on them all the time. Let's have some grace for them. But I'm even more excited about the fact that she showed a lot of maturity. So that's excellent. Got to give a shout out to the men's and women's basketball team for also bringing home the gold. Major shout out to Steph. Steph Curry was truly the MVP. I mean, he really got off when he needed to. And it was really just good to see that team gel when they needed to come together, because I'll be honest with you, I was worried for a little bit that they, especially against that last game in Serbia in that third quarter, that they weren't going to make it, but they pulled it out, and shout out to all them brothers, man. To be honest with you, I was going to give you guys a brief update on the presidential campaign and where it's at. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to save that for the premium customers, right? So it's going to be a premium episode. So premium customers, this week's episode will be an update on where the campaign is, where it's not, and where it should be. And if you want to get that, you're going to have to go to patreon.com/church politics. You have to be a monthly subscriber, and you'll get these premium episodes with basically segments that we don't put out for everybody. All right. So check that out. Also, if you become a patron, then you can ask us questions. We'll answer your questions and go back and forth with you. So hopefully you guys sign up for that. And just want to give, a shout out to all our patrons and supporters for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. There would not be an AND campaign. There would not be a Church Politics podcast without you. So thank you for being a part of the movement, not just standing on the sidelines, but saying, I want to be a part of this movement to push forward something that the church really needs in the public square. But we have a really good episode coming for you. I think many of you will appreciate this episode. So let's go ahead and get into it. Grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. And if y'all Christian brothers and sisters don't mind, let me start with some scripture, okay? And I want to start at Proverbs 11, verse 3, which says, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity." The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity, their double-mindedness, their saying one thing and doing another. Well, I had the pleasure of sending my two oldest sons, my Warrior Scholars, off to their first day of the school year this morning. And I told them somewhat emotionally that as they were doing their work, that I wanted them to remember the generations of sacrifices that have been made to give them the opportunities that they have. That I wanted them to think about all those folks who walked in faith and belief in God, believing that one day their progeny would have a better chance at flourishing, would have a better chance at upward mobility, would have a better chance at freedom. Now, we know that in America, we have not fully arrived, but we have taken some significant steps, and I can see those steps in my sons. And I wanted them to know, as they did their work, as they came into obstacles, as things got hard, to think of all the sacrifices that were made for them. And we also talk a lot about integrity, right? I talk to them about being who they say they are and doing what's right, even when nobody is watching, right? I drill into them, be a man of character, be a man of consequence, be a man of integrity. And it's interesting because maybe one day they will discover that when I preach to them about these things, that I'm also preaching to myself. Like many fathers, I would imagine, my instruction to them pushes me to try my best to model integrity for them. If I'm going to teach them about something, I have to model it for them. I just can't say it. And so I bring up what happened this morning into this conversation because I think that all of us need to ask ourselves, what does integrity look like in this political moment? What does integrity demand from us as we take positions in this election? What does God demand from us? Because as we know, integrity comes at a cost. Integrity and popularity are often in conflict, as Jesus shows us in John 6, when he gave that difficult teaching. He gave that hard teaching, and what happened? People walked away. Many times, integrity and trying to do what's right comes with misunderstanding. Now, let me say this, and I say this with confidence. I am godly proud of how Chris and I have conducted ourselves during this election cycle. I believe that we have conducted ourselves with integrity, and not by accident. We deliberately set out to conduct ourselves with integrity during this time because we believe that's what God has called us to do, but that's what Christians need in the civic space. Now, have all our predictions been right? Not even close. Has every episode been perfectly balanced from the standpoint of how we talk about each candidate? No, but honestly, that's not the objective. Our objective on this show is to be impartial. And I think that we've done that, notwithstanding the criticism that we may get from this way or that way. Okay. We have not run from what needs to be said. And I'll be honest with you, if we start running from what needs to be said, I struggle to understand what value we're bringing to the church and what value we're bringing to politics. If we don't say things that need to be said for our own interest, I don't know that we have much to offer you. I think that's what our audience comes to hear. So I just want you to know that I want to move forward in this conversation with integrity in mind and with the belief that God did not give the AND campaign this moderately sized platform to make ourselves more popular and to make ourselves beloved, which, as somebody who speaks publicly, is always a temptation. All right, I'm not going to lie to you about that. But the reason that I bring this up and the connection between integrity and what we're about to say is that someone on Twitter commented that he used to support these third wave movements, right? Which is these movements like the AND campaign who say, man, I see the faults on the left. I see the faults on the right. There has to be a better way. He said he used to support them, but then he realized that they really just criticized the right and didn't really hold the left accountable as they should. Now, I saw this and I read it, but I didn't see who said it. And so by the time I looked for it again, I couldn't find it. But somebody on Twitter was saying that. And my response to that is I don't think that's always the case. It's certainly not the case with the AND campaign, but there is something to that. A lot of these third way groups are harder on the right, and maybe because they think the right is worse. And I think the right is worse on a lot of issues, not all issues, but I think they'd have some serious issues. But I think there is an avoidance in some instances on really fully critiquing the left. And I don't want to make that mistake today. Okay. When he said this, the thing that brought it up is when he said this, he was referencing a group called Evangelicals for Harris. All right. That was his frame of reference. And I'm not saying that I agree with his evaluation of that, but that's what made him say that, it seemed like. Now, last week, Evangelicals for Harris was rolled out in support of the Harris campaign. It's an affinity group that seems to be trying to galvanize that demographic in support of Vice President Kamala Harris. All right. Now, for the sake of transparency, I'm familiar and close with a lot of the leaders who were listed as speakers at this first meeting, which occurred on Wednesday. Okay, I think it was like a Zoom meeting. It was the first meeting that they were getting together, or maybe it was like an interest meeting. Many of these people I respect. Some of them are associated with the AND campaign. I'm gonna tell you that straight up, which is okay. I mean, that happens from time to time. The AND campaign itself does not endorse, but we have people who are endorsing different candidates who are associated with us, not in, not a part of the main kind of group of leadership. Now, as I've said before, there is no biblical prohibition on Christian leaders endorsing candidates. I don't really advise it, and I encourage caution in doing it, but I'm not going to add to God's law and say that people can't do it, right? That's their choice to make. I think there are some serious landmines that you need to avoid when you do that, but there's no prohibition. There's no explicit prohibition against it. And I'll be honest with you, I'd probably agree with many of this group's opinions on the potential dangers of a Trump presidency. We do have some agreements there. I don't think that I question whether Trump has a commitment to the truth. I question whether Trump has a commitment to the people. I question whether Trump has a commitment to democracy instead of really just having a commitment to himself. Now, I would say that I may not go as far as some as to say if he gets in again, democracy is definitely over. I don't think it happens like that. I think there's a lot of damage that could be done. I don't know that democracy is over and he becomes some kind of dictator. I don't think it's that easy. I think America democracy doesn't work like that, and it's not in the shape where he would just easily be able to overturn everything. That doesn't make it good. That's not really a compliment. I don't know that I go so far as some people in that regard. Okay. Now, when I talk to people, and this is just generally, when I talk to many people about why they're supporting Harris, it seems like it's just enough that she's not Trump. They're saying, hey, she's not Trump, period. She's got my support. Okay. But what I think is even more concerning than that is for others, I've seen a type of elation that I can't honestly say is warranted if we're being sober, impartial, and judicious. Now, let's deal with the fact that we only have two primary candidates, right? There are some third-party people. It's unlikely the third-party people are going to win. So you have to deal within the practicality of that. And I think that some people are dealing with that and saying, hey, let's be honest. There's only two choices. This is my choice. Okay, cool. Again, the more concerning ones are when you see the type of elation again that I don't think is warranted if we're being sober, impartial, and judicious. Okay. I think one of the primary knocks on Harris is true. And that knock on her is that it's hard to know what she really stands for. It's hard to know what she really believes. It's hard to know what her convictions are. All right. And at this time, when she hasn't done any interviews, she hasn't laid out her policy plan, and within the past few weeks, she has kind of flip-flopped on healthcare, immigration, and fracking, you kind of have to ask the question, well, what's the elation for if we don't know exactly where she stands on these things? All right. None of the things that are most important to know about the leader who will be the most powerful person in the world have been answered in this abbreviated process. And that's even if we can even call it a process. Like, this has been a very, very short process without a lot of substance. And I believe that I would be a complete fraud if I did not call that into question. What is the elation being based on? Again, that's not specific for this group. I'm just saying in general, for people who are responding like that, where is that coming from? Because what I see from a lot of people is support based on profile, support based on vibes, support based on how they personally identify with the candidate, which is always a part of American politics on both sides, but it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient when MAGA Christians do it, and it's not sufficient for any other group or any other person that's going all in for a candidate, okay? I clearly won't be making the case for Trump, right? But there are questions that concern citizens, and more importantly, impartial Christians must ask about what's going on right now. Somebody would say, well, she has a great resume. That's all I need to see is her resume. Don't you believe she has a great resume, Justin? Absolutely. She has one of the best resumes that you would find. But guess what? Resume alone doesn't fully qualify somebody to be the president. You have to prove that you're fit to be the president by submitting yourself to public examination and public scrutiny, and that has not happened, right? Maybe there are people who are close to her, who have a personal relationship that know more than I know, but that has not fully happened in this very abbreviated process. So somebody would have to ask, for those who are elated and not just saying she's not Trump, if that's enough for you, cool. What are we basing this on? And why do you say that? I say that because people are suffering. People need better health care. They need better job opportunities, and they need better housing. Last I checked, profile, vibes, and symbolism will not supply those things. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. So if you're wondering or questioning the motivation behind this critique, that's it. People are suffering, and there's no loyalty that I have that forces me to ignore the things that really matter when we're talking about the most powerful position in the world and people hurting and needing good policy and needing good leadership. I don't have those kind of loyalties that I set that aside and just move forward. All right. Now, these are the questions that I think we need to bring up. Now, something that I saw on the internet, let's get back to the Evangelicals for Harris. Something that I saw initially when they rolled out did worry me, and let me say what that was. When I went to Twitter and I looked at the profile, here's what the profile said. The bio for the profile. It said, faithful, compassionate evangelicals exercising our God-given citizenship by voting for someone who truly reflects Christian values. When I saw that, it looked like MAGA Christianity in reverse. You cannot critique MAGA Christians for basically saying Trump is God's candidate, then turn around and say, no, Kamala is God's candidate. That's not acceptable. However, they did change it. Okay. So I don't know who initially wrote it, but they did change it. Here's what it now says. It says faithful, compassionate evangelicals exercising our God-given citizenship by voting for someone who better reflects Christian values. I think that's more acceptable. But you could see how people would feel like, well, there's a duplicity here. How do we have both? Somebody within the group said, hey, that is not the way to state it. And I'm glad that has been changed, but it pushes us towards the whole question that I'm asking. Now, I pray that this group does good. I pray that there's some in there that know more about what she has offered to the public, more than what she has offered to the public, more than what I have seen, but it's not there. Could it be there? Time will tell. We still have 80 some days to move forward and figure this out. But the game that the campaign is playing right now, with not doing any interviews, not putting out policy, hardly any policy on the website, is a problem, right? I pray, because they have the right, and I know there's a lot of thoughtful people in this, they have the right to support a candidate. But I pray that they are pushing her on policies and getting concessions behind the scenes. Because if they're not, they're remiss. All right. You have to say, even with MAGA Christians, they forced his hand and made him make some concessions. Right. Not doing that so much this time around, but the first time they got out of somebody who's not really culturally conservative, they got him to do some of those things, and he was opportunistic enough to do it. All right. But we got to make sure, I hope that people are pushing folks behind the scenes to say, hey, here are some of the things we're okay with and that we need you to do. Here's some things that you can't do. I hope that those conversations are being had in a real way, and we're not just so excited that we're jumping all in and not being shrewd enough to push back. Here's the other thing. Her stances on religious liberty, her stances on abortion, Tim Walz's stances on parental rights need to be checked. And if evangelicals for Harris are not willing to check those, I think that's problematic. They both have some very, I would almost go to the point of saying, anti-Christian views when it comes to religious liberty, or actions when it comes to religious liberty and when it comes to parental rights. Somebody needs to say something about that. And you can't wait till the election is over and think she's going to hear you out on that. Other people are pushing. Corporations are pushing. Other interest groups are pushing to say, hey, before you get our support, you got to do this, 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 and this. Are we doing that? I don't know that they're not. All right. I don't know that they're not. I hope this isn't a group that is just going to push campaign talking points. Again, we cannot criticize MAGA Christians for being uncritical about Trump and then turn around and be uncritical about Harris. You can endorse a candidate. You cannot turn a blind eye to that candidate's flaws. As a Christian leader, you should not be used as a prop. You should not be used as to go out and just do what somebody else tells you to do. Apply the same standard. Let's just make sure we're applying the same standard, right? And I want to be very clear. This is not a condemnation, but it is very much a challenge. And I think my integrity demanded that I make the challenge, and the integrity of those who are part of the group demands that as they move forward in this challenge, what I'm saying, as you move forward, make sure you hold the same standard to yourself. Because I believe that not being Trump is far from being enough. Practically speaking, it's going to be one of them, and you can take that into consideration, but people are hurting. And many of the things that I'm seeing, again, vibes, profile, symbolism, are not going to feed the hungry. They're not going to fix the border. They're not going to negotiate with Putin. They're not going to get our economy right. They're not going to fix housing. That's my motivation for this challenge. And hopefully we have Christians on both sides of the conversation that answer that call. We'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. So we into this, man. Another interesting conversation is going on right now, too. And it comes from a report from City Journal. And this is pretty big news. City Journal said this: the American Society of Plastic Surgeons becomes the first major medical association to challenge the consensus of medical groups over gender-affirming care for minors. So that's sex reassignment surgeries, puberty blockers for minors. The consensus on this, where everybody was together, there's now kind of a division. So here's what the article says. The main justification for gender-affirming care for minors in the United States has been that all major U.S. medical associations support it. Critics of this supposed consensus have argued that it is not grounded in high-quality research or decades of honest and robust deliberation among clinicians with different viewpoints and experiences. Instead, it is the result of a small number of ideologically driven doctor association members and LGBT-focused committees who exploit their colleagues' trust. Okay? Physicians presenting different viewpoints are silenced or kept away from decision-making circles, ensuring the appearance of unanimity. As the UK's Cass Review pointed out, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and the U.S. Endocrine Society were especially important in forging this consensus, and they did so by citing each other's statements rather than conducting a scientific appraisal of the evidence. The circularity of this approach, says Cass in a report to England's National Health Service, may explain why there has been an apparent consensus on key areas of practice despite the evidence being poor. They go on to say, but the U.S. consensus now appears to have its first big fracture. In July, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, a major medical association representing 11,000 members and over 90% of the field in the U.S. and Canada, told me that it has not endorsed any organization's practice recommendations for the treatment of adolescents with gender dysphoria. This organization acknowledged that there is considerable uncertainty as to the long-term efficacy for the use of chest and genital surgical interventions, and that the existing evidence base is viewed as low quality and low certainty. Wow. It's been interesting how this conversation, and I always want to say this before we get into this. I believe there are people who are genuinely struggling with this, that there are parents who are genuinely struggling and have made a decision one way or the other because they believe it's the best interest of their child and they love their child. And it's, these approaches are novel. There's a lot of new information out there, a lot of new advice. Unless you're in that situation, don't take lightly the decision that a parent might have to make in that situation. God loves these children. God loves these adults who are dealing with transgenderism. Even if you go to what happened, and then this wasn't transgenderism, it was intersex, but even what happened in the Olympic boxing, even if you felt like this person should not have competed against women, the attacks were unnecessary and not cool. So before we get into this, I want to push back on people who are hypercritical, mean, and nasty about this issue. If you can't come into this conversation about transgenderism with a broken heart, you should probably sit it out, because it's not an easy conversation. It's not just a bunch of people who are evil trying to do evil things. Do I think there's a wickedness in some of how this has been presented to the public, how this is presented to parents and children? Absolutely. But it's not that simple, okay? One of the issues that I've had with this consensus on transgenderism is really what they hitting on this article. When you make a drastic change in how you see a very serious issue like this, it needs to be backed by science, and it needs to be backed by a serious conversation, not only between the experts, but a serious conversation that's fully been communicated with the people and run through the public square. That never happened. And so we're making these drastic changes to children and moving forward with this without that real conversation. One thing I've also had to deal with and come to terms with is that individual doctors are generally listening to these associations. So we talk about, well, this is between a doctor and their patient. Yes and no, because doctors are not taking time to make independent evaluations of how all this should go. As I said before, they're also not philosopher kings. They're generally going to listen to what the medical association is saying. And if the medical association process has lost its integrity, that's going to flood down to individual physicians and all that other stuff. Okay. So if the well is poisoned at the medical association level, it poisons everything else that comes down from it. And now you have these plastic surgeons, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, that's saying the evidence to support this type of care, quote unquote, the evidence is low quality. The evidence is not certain. We haven't gone through the scientific process or the process of discourse to come to this place, right? Now, I want you to keep in mind, this also plays into the election. You have a vice presidential candidate who has basically said in some ways that you can lose your child if you don't want them to go through this process, which again, doesn't have the scientific basis, doesn't have the foundation to even know what the outcomes are going to be long term. And I have to ask people on the right, Christians on the right, you need to be more compassionate about this, because it's not that easy. And parents are making these decisions with not a whole lot of information and with broken hearts. But I'm going to ask Christians who lean left, do you have nothing to say about how this process went, how it's gone, and the fact that we're basing such major decisions on low quality evidence, on uncertainty on what the long-term impacts will be? Have you nothing to say? Or are we just going to be secular apologist Christians that we think something's right as long as it's on the opposite side of what conservatives are saying. And I see that so much. We will jump on a bandwagon because we want to be different than toxic evangelicals without really even having the foundation for that we're standing on. And there's been a question that's been raised, a real question as to how much Christians on the left are even contributing to the conversation in culture and politics and social issues when they really just go along with whatever the left says. They do whatever the left says and they feel good about it because it's on the opposite side of evangelicals. Well, guess what? That's not critical thinking. That's no better than the people who you say you have a problem with. So I think all Christians, I'm not an expert in this. I want to bring you guys the news that's coming out of here, the updates, just so you know what's going on. This is a problem, and it's going to be interesting to see if this consensus starts to have even more kind of divisions within it. Because again, the evidence really just has never been convincing. The narrative isn't all that convincing. Yet some Christians, it's good enough if they're just against the wrong people, right? We'll be back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up, but with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Amen. Got off my knees and put it into my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And I am back on the Church Politics Podcast. There's something else going on. We don't do a whole lot of international news. I'm not an expert on international issues, and so we don't do it a whole lot, but we think we need to touch on things that are just big enough and that may have some kind of implications here in America. And if you haven't been watching, there's been some serious riots in the United Kingdom. All right. And I looked and kind of saw it. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I had to do some research to find out really what was happening here. And apparently there are some censorship implications, but it's a complicated matter. And so let's kind of get into that just so you know what's going on. According to BBC, the fatal stabbing of 3 young girls at a dance class in the seaside town of Southport, which is, I guess, in North England, has been followed by the worst unrest that the UK has seen in more than a decade. The article goes on to say the violence in towns and cities across England and in Northern Ireland has been fueled by misinformation online, the far right, and anti-immigration sentiment. So most of these people are on the right that are going, and it's gotten pretty crazy. If you look at the pictures, look at what's going on, it's pretty wild. The article goes on to say, almost immediately after the attack, social media posts falsely speculated that the suspect was an asylum seeker who arrived in the UK on a boat in 2023 with an incorrect name being widely circulated, right? So they put out this false name, this false profile, and people just went crazy because it probably fed into a lot of the frustrations that they were already having with what's going on with immigration there, and probably just a lot of other things as we tend to do. There were also unfounded rumors that he was a Muslim. This was not true. In fact, the BBC and other media outlets reported that the suspect was born in Wales. So he's from there. He's born in Wales, but he had Rwandan parents who I think were Christians. Okay, so this was not a Muslim asylum seeker who just went and killed these 3 girls and injured others. All right, so important to know, but that's how this started. Now, I did some more research, and I came into contact with this article from Reason magazine, and Reason's kind of like a center-right, I would say, a magazine. But here's what they had to say. They were saying that some of the members of parliament wanted social media companies to ban user accounts accused of inciting violence, and they have criticized these companies for not following such instructions previously. The Labor member of Parliament, Chris Curtis, argued that social media bosses need to step up and deal with with vile messages, stoking division and egging on violence. Similarly, conservative and shadow home security secretary James Cleverly said it was unacceptable for social media companies to take the profits but not comply with their responsibilities. These parliament members even want to haul ex-owner Twitter, Elon Musk, before a parliamentary committee to explain the platform's role in spreading this misinformation. Now, Reason kind of goes on to say that they're blaming this all on misinformation, but there's really some other issues they have to deal with. Like, they really do need to deal with immigration and things of that nature, even though that wasn't the cause here. And I think we do have to look really hard at the fact that it was false information that led to all of this stuff, right? So it's not unreasonable, in my estimation, for somebody to say, hey, this is leading to violence and could lead to death. We need to make sure that you guys are held responsible, or that you do something to make sure that this isn't spread in that way. I don't think that's too much to ask, because we can see how that can happen. We can see, even with our election coming up, something happens, somebody spreads some false information and people go crazy before they even check into it. All right. I get why people would have that desire and want to prevent that. And I think, especially when it comes to inciting violence, you don't have a constitutional right here in the United States to incite violence. Now, it's one very, very important thing about this is the UK does not have the same freedom of speech as the United States does, right? So we need to know, when it comes to that freedom of speech, it is different. And so they have more leeway when it comes to making demands and censoring to a certain extent, certain groups. Okay. But even in the United States, when it comes to inciting violence, when it comes to misinformation by itself is not against the idea of freedom of speech. That's very important. But if you are actually making threats, if you are inciting violence, that becomes a different conversation. Okay. That's where we need to look at right now, because the connection that I see here is we have a high probability of political violence. I can't even say high probability. We've already had political violence in this election. We had a presidential candidate who was not even inches, I guess, from dying based on an assassination attempt. Okay. As a group of people who believe in the freedom of speech, how do we make sure that this doesn't happen to us? There's a tension here, right? There's a tension between letting people say what they want to say, even if we don't like it, even if it's not true facts. But here's the argument that I would guess a defender of freedom of speech would make. I can give bad information. I can say, hey, the guy that did this, I can give you the wrong description on social media. That's not a violation of freedom of speech. That the connection between my information and them acting violently, there's a distance between that. Because I didn't say go out and kill everybody under this description. I just gave what the description was, even though it was false. So it's a complicated case. And I think we need to understand. So some people would just say, hey, because this can happen, and you hear this from some people on the left, more so the establishment left, because people can give misinformation and it really can cause some damage, we need to tamp down on people who we think are putting out misinformation. I get that. The problem with that is who decides, and when they decide, how do we know that they don't expand that definition or apply the rule in a way that really is in the interest of their side, and it shuts people up that need to speak? This is the whole issue with freedom of speech and why it's hard. Anyone who truly understands freedom of speech knows that there's a certain risk that comes with it. That the risk is people will say things that's not necessarily illegal, or that they're not prohibited from saying, but that cause people to do things that they shouldn't do, or that puts information out there that can cause problems in other ways. But when you cut it off, to cut that off and to prevent it fully, you have to put a weapon in somebody's hands that I don't know that there's any group in America that can be trusted to wield in the right way. That is really the tension when it comes to freedom of speech. Don't want people putting false information. Don't want people making people feel a certain way or attacking people. But once you try to tamp down on it, you're giving somebody an opportunity to shut people up that need to be heard. And if we look through history, rarely, if ever, is there a case where somebody, or especially some group, is honest enough and trustworthy enough not to use it for their purposes. And so what we have done is said, we will take the risk to make sure that nobody who needs to be heard is shut up. It's a give and take. There's this pros and cons, but that's where we are. And that's why freedom of speech is important, if not very complicated as well. Well, that's the episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Even though we didn't have Chris with us, I think it was a good conversation. I hope that we will all hold ourselves to standards. I hope that we all can take critique without thinking that somebody's doing it for negative reasons or some ulterior motive. And that's really what I think primarily this episode was about. Everybody needs the same standard. Everybody needs critique. And what does integrity demand from all of us? And Camp, there's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the boldness and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, Ann Camp. We'll holla at you.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.